Sarah's stethoscope trembled against her chest as she tried to process what she was witnessing. The tent had fallen unnaturally quiet, despite housing 17 critically injured children. Where moments before there had been crying, labored breathing, and the desperate whispers of pain, now there was something else entirely, a stillness that felt almost sacred. Amira's vitals had stabilized. Sarah checked the monitors twice, certain the equipment was malfunctioning. The child's heart rate, which had been dangerously erratic just minutes ago, now displayed a steady rhythm that belonged to someone sleeping peacefully, not someone with metal fragments millimeters from their aorta. Dr. Chen, her Syrian medical assistant, appeared at her elbow. His English carried the weight of exhaustion that had become their constant companion over the past 6 months. The Rashid boy. His internal bleeding has stopped. Sarah's head snapped up. Omar Rashid, age 6, had arrived with suspected liver lacerations that should have required immediate surgery they couldn't perform in this makeshift facility. They'd been preparing to transport him to Damascus, knowing he likely wouldn't survive the journey. That's impossible. Sarah moved to Omar's cot, her eyes scanning the child who lay calm and alert, his color returning. Like Amira, his gaze was fixed on that same empty corner, and his lips moved in conversation with someone Sarah couldn't see. "Doctor, they're all improving." Khalil's voice carried a mixture of wonder and fear. Every child who was critical, their conditions are stabilizing simultaneously. Sarah's training kicked in, the rational part of her mind scrambling for medical explanations. Shock could mask symptoms temporarily. Adrenaline could provide false improvements. Mass hysteria could create shared delusions. But vital signs didn't lie, and the monitors surrounding her painted a picture that defied everything she understood about trauma medicine. A soft giggle drew her attention back to Amira. The little girl was sitting up now, something that should have been physically impossible given her injuries. Her dark eyes sparkled with joy as she continued her one-sided conversation, occasionally nodding as if listening intently to responses only she could hear. "What are you talking about, sweetheart?" Sarah knelt beside the cot, her voice gentle despite the chaos in her mind. Amira turned to her with the patient expression children reserve for adults who are being particularly slow. "He's telling me about the stars. Did you know each one has a name? Who is telling you this?" Jesus. The name fell from the child's lips with such casual certainty that Sarah felt something shift in her chest, not medical, but deeper. "He says you look sad." Sarah's breath caught. The grief she carried like a physical weight, the loss of Emma that had driven her across oceans to this war zone, suddenly felt exposed under the innocent observation of a child who shouldn't be conscious, let alone conversational. "He says he knows about Emma," Amira continued, and Sarah's world tilted. She had never mentioned Emma to any of the children, never spoken her daughter's name in this tent where other people's children fought for their lives. The grief was too raw, too personal to share with colleagues, let alone patients. "How do you—" Sarah began, but Amira had already turned back to the corner, nodding seriously at whatever she was being told. Around them, the other children had begun to move. Those who could walk were slowly making their way toward the same spot that held Amira's attention. A boy with bandaged eyes navigated the tent with impossible confidence. Twin sisters, both with broken legs, helped each other across the space with determination that transcended their injuries. Sarah stood on unsteady legs, her scientific mind reeling. Mass hallucination was possible, but mass healing, the improvement in their conditions was too rapid, too comprehensive to be explained by conventional medicine. Yet here she stood, surrounded by evidence that challenged everything she'd built her identity upon. The tent flap rustled, and Dr. Hassan, the facility director, entered with fresh supplies. His footsteps faltered as he took in the scene. Children gathered peacefully in conversation with empty air, monitors showing stable readings where chaos had reigned moments before. "Sarah, what?" He stopped mid-sentence, his gaze following the children's focus to the corner where nothing visible waited. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. For 30 years she'd had answers, diagnoses, treatment plans. Now she stood in a bombed-out medical tent in Syria, watching children commune with the invisible while their bodies healed in ways that defied medical explanation. Amira looked up at her again, her small hand reaching out to take Sarah's much larger one. "He wants to know if you'll stay and listen too." Sarah stared at the empty corner, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. In the distance she could hear the rumble of aircraft, promising more casualties, more impossible choices between who could be saved and who couldn't. But in this moment, surrounded by healing she couldn't explain, Sarah Chen faced a choice that would reshape everything she thought she knew about medicine, faith, and the boundaries between the seen and unseen worlds. Sarah's hand remained frozen in Amira's gentle grasp, caught between the child's innocent invitation and 30 years of medical training that screamed, this was impossible. The rumble of aircraft grew louder overhead, a reminder that in 20 minutes or 2 hours, or tomorrow, this tent would once again fill with broken bodies and the desperate mathematics of triage. Sarah began, then stopped. What could she say? That she needed to document these miraculous recoveries, that she should be running blood panels and ordering CT scans they didn't have, that everything happening here violated the fundamental laws of physiology she'd sworn her life to uphold? Dr. Hassan moved closer, his weathered face creased with the same bewilderment Sarah felt. In the 6 months they'd worked together, she'd come to respect his steady competence, his ability to perform miracles of medicine with barely functional equipment and limited supplies. But this went beyond medicine. Sarah, Hassan's voice was barely audible. In 40 years of practice, I have never... He gestured helplessly at the peaceful gathering of children, all oriented toward that empty corner like flowers following invisible sunlight. The normalcy of the gesture struck her suddenly. These children, who should be writhing in pain or unconscious from trauma, were simply talking. Amira's thumb traced gentle circles on Sarah's knuckles, the same comforting gesture Emma used to make during bedtime stories. The memory hit like a physical blow. Emma, who would have been 11 now. Emma, who used to curl up in Sarah's lap after particularly difficult surgeries and ask why people got hurt. Sarah had always given clinical explanations. Accidents happen, bodies break, medicine fixes what it can. She'd never mentioned the cases that haunted her, the children she couldn't save, the parents whose worlds collapsed in sterile waiting rooms, until she became one of those parents. "Dr. Chen?" Khalil appeared with a supply cart, his movements automatic despite the unprecedented scene before him. The afternoon shift is requesting the patient update reports. Patient reports. The mundane anchor of hospital routine that had structured Sarah's adult life. Morning rounds at 6 a.m. sharp, always starting with the most critical cases. Coffee that had long since lost any pretense of flavor, consumed while reviewing lab results and surgical schedules, the careful documentation that turned human suffering into neat categories of diagnosis and prognosis. She'd built her identity on that structure, on being Dr. Sarah Chen, who saved lives through precision and knowledge. Even here, in this bombed-out facility thousands of miles from Johns Hopkins, she'd maintained the rituals. Early morning inventory of supplies, detailed case notes written by flickering generator light, the steady rhythm of work that kept grief at bay. But what report could she write about this? How did you document healing that defied medical explanation? How did you categorize conversations with the invisible? "The reports can wait," Hassan said quietly, reading something in her expression. He'd been doing that more often lately, watching her with the careful attention of someone who recognized a colleague on the edge of breaking. Sarah had been broken before, 3 years ago when the emergency room doors had opened and she'd seen Emma on the gurney. The terrible irony of being the trauma surgeon who couldn't operate on her own daughter, the medical professional reduced to helpless panic in a hospital hallway. She'd taken leave from her position, then extended it, then found herself volunteering for increasingly remote assignments. Running from the life where Emma's absence echoed in every room of their house. Running from David, whose quiet grief was a mirror she couldn't bear to look into, running from the colleagues who offered careful condolences and then expected her to return to normal, as if normal still existed. This assignment in Syria was supposed to be her furthest escape yet, 6 months in a place where other people's tragedies would drown out her own, where the constant stream of casualties would numb the specific ache of losing Emma, where she could disappear into the mechanical precision of emergency medicine and forget that she'd once been someone who read bedtime stories and helped with homework. But Amira's small hand in hers felt like an anchor to something she'd thought was lost forever. The child's peaceful expression reminded her of Emma's face during their last conversation, when her daughter had asked if heaven was real and Sarah had given her usual scientific deflection about different people believing different things. "He says you're thinking about her again," Amira said softly, not looking away from the corner, but somehow knowing Sarah's attention had drifted. The aircraft rumble was closer now, close enough that they'd need to prepare for new casualties soon. The ordinary world of medical crisis management would reassert itself, the world where Sarah knew her role, her capabilities, her limitations, where she could lose herself in the familiar rhythm of saving who she could and mourning who she couldn't. But for this suspended moment, surrounded by impossible healing and a child's invitation to believe in something beyond the boundaries of her training, Sarah Chen stood at the threshold between the life she'd constructed and something entirely unknown. The choice remained: step forward into mystery or retreat into the comfortable certainty of medical science that had failed her when she needed it most. The aircraft engines roared overhead, their sound growing from distant thunder to immediate threat. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded mass casualties, the body's automatic preparation for the next wave of broken children and impossible choices. But this time, something was different. This time, she hesitated. "Dr. Chen." Khalil's voice carried new urgency. "Radio dispatch reports multiple strikes in the residential district. We need to prepare for—" The tent shuddered as the first explosion echoed across the city, close enough to rattle the medical equipment. Sarah's hand tightened reflexively around Amira's, expecting the child to startle, to cry, to react with the terror that bombing runs inevitably brought. Instead, Amira squeezed back gently, her attention never wavering from the invisible figure in the corner. "It's okay," the little girl whispered, though Sarah couldn't tell if she was speaking to the empty air or to her. "He says it's going to be different this time." The second explosion sent a tremor through the ground. In the distance, Sarah could hear the wail of sirens, the shouts of rescue workers, the terrible familiar symphony that meant her world was about to flood with new casualties. Dr. Hassan was already moving toward the supply station, his movements automatic after months of this routine. Khalil began clearing space near the entrance, preparing triage areas with the efficiency born of too much practice. But Sarah remained frozen between worlds, one foot in the impossible peace surrounding Amira, the other in the approaching storm of medical crisis that would demand every skill she possessed. "Doctor," Hassan's voice cut through her paralysis. "We need you." The words that had defined her adult life. "We need you." In operating rooms across 3 decades, in emergency departments, in this makeshift clinic where children's lives hung by threads thinner than surgical sutures. She'd built her identity on being needed, on being the steady hands that could hold death at bay through knowledge and precision. A third explosion. Closer still, the tense canvas walls rippled and dust rained from the ceiling supports. Outside, she could hear vehicles approaching, ambulances, or what passed for ambulances in this shattered city. Soon the tent would fill again with the controlled chaos she knew how to navigate: blood pressures and oxygen saturation, surgical priorities and resource allocation, the brutal mathematics of triage where emotions became luxuries they couldn't afford. But as she tried to pull her hand free from Amira's grasp, the child held fast with surprising strength. "He's leaving," Amira said, her voice carrying a note of disappointment that pierced through Sarah's clinical preparation. But he says he'll come back when you're ready to really see him. Around the tent, the other children began to stir from their peaceful gathering. The boy with bandaged eyes turned toward the sound of approaching vehicles, his expression shifting from transcendent calm to the wariness of someone who had learned that loud noises meant pain. The twin sisters helped each other back toward their cots, their movements still remarkably fluid for children with compound fractures, but no longer impossibly graceful. Whatever had been happening here, divine intervention, mass hysteria, or something beyond Sarah's ability to categorize, was dissolving back into the ordinary world of medical emergency. The monitors still showed stable vitals for children who should be critical, but the sacred stillness was evaporating like morning mist under the harsh sun of approaching crisis. "Dr. Chen!" Khalil's shout carried real urgency now. The first ambulance had arrived, its siren cutting off abruptly in the way that meant serious casualties inside. Sarah looked down at Amira, whose dark eyes reflected a knowledge that no 8-year-old should possess. The child's grip relaxed, releasing Sarah's hand with what felt like benediction. "You have to help them," Amira said simply. "But remember, there are different ways to heal people." The tent flap burst open, admitting a flood of late afternoon light and the first stretcher. A boy, perhaps 10 years old, his clothing torn and bloody. Behind him, paramedics carried a girl whose left arm hung at an impossible angle. Then another child, and another, the familiar parade of war's youngest victims. Dr. Hassan was already moving, his experienced eye assessing injuries and calling out initial treatment priorities. Khalil rolled the supply cart toward the new arrivals, his hands steady despite the chaos. The ordinary world of medical crisis had reasserted itself with vengeance, demanding Sarah's complete attention and skill. But as she moved toward the stretchers, muscle memory taking over the familiar dance of emergency medicine, Sarah carried with her the impossible memory of children, healed by conversation with empty air. The choice she'd faced moments ago, between mystery and certainty, between faith and science, hadn't been resolved. It had been interrupted. And as she reached for her stethoscope, beginning the triage assessment that would determine who lived and who died among these new casualties, Sarah realized that the interruption itself might be the most significant thing of all, because for the first time in 3 years, she approached suffering children while carrying something other than grief and clinical detachment. She carried questions. The boy on the first stretcher couldn't have been older than 10, his school uniform torn and stained with blood that looked too bright against the faded blue fabric. Sarah's hands moved automatically to check his pulse, her fingers finding the rapid flutter of a frightened child's heartbeat beneath skin that felt too cold, too fragile. "Shrapnel wounds to the abdomen and left thigh," the paramedic reported in Arabic, then switched to broken English for her benefit. "Found under classroom debris, conscious but showing signs of shock." Sarah nodded, her clinical assessment taking precedence, even as part of her mind remained fixed on Amira's impossible words, "There are different ways to heal people." What did that mean when faced with metal fragments embedded in a child's torso? What healing existed beyond surgical extraction and antibiotic protocols? "Get him to bed 3, she instructed Khalil, then moved to the girl with the mangled arm. The limb hung at an angle that made Sarah's stomach clench, compound fracture of the humerus, possibly damage to the brachial artery. In a fully equipped hospital, this would be challenging but manageable. Here, with limited surgical supplies and no orthopedic specialist, it could mean amputation. The girl's eyes found Sarah's, dark and pleading with the silent question every injured child asked, "Will you make it stop hurting?" For 30 years, Sarah had answered that question with medical precision, medications and procedures, surgical intervention and careful monitoring. The reliable tools of modern medicine that reduced suffering to manageable problems with documented solutions. But today, with Amira's steady gaze following her movements and the memory of impossible healing fresh in her mind, Sarah felt the inadequacy of her answers in a way that made her hesitate. The girl needed immediate surgical intervention to save the arm, required resources they barely had and expertise that demanded unwavering confidence. Yet Sarah found herself paralyzed by questions that had never existed before. What if there was another way? What if the healing she'd witnessed wasn't mass hysteria, but something beyond her understanding? What if her entire career had been built on treating symptoms while ignoring causes she couldn't see? Doctor? Dr. Hassan's voice carried concern as he noticed her stillness. The girl's vitals are dropping. The familiar weight of medical responsibility crashed back over her, muscle memory overriding philosophical uncertainty. Sarah reached for the tourniquet, her hands steady despite the chaos in her mind. She could explore impossible questions. Later, right now, a child needed her skills to keep bleeding flesh connected to living bone. But as she worked, adjusting pressure and calling out instructions for surgical preparation, Sarah felt the presence of every choice she'd made over 3 decades of practice. Every time she'd dismissed a patient's mention of prayer as psychological comfort. Every family gathering where she'd explained away their uncle's unexpected recovery or grandmother's peaceful death as statistical anomalies. Every conversation with Emma about the nature of existence that she'd deflected with scientific rationalism. "He says you're thinking about her again," Amira had said, somehow knowing about Emma without being told. Children didn't possess telepathic abilities, that was established medical fact. Grief hallucinations were common among trauma survivors, also documented. But the monitors hadn't lied about those impossible recoveries, and Sarah's hands had felt the absence of fever that should have been burning through damaged tissue. "Prep the surgical kit," Hassan called out. His attention focused on a boy whose chest rose and fell with a labored rhythm of potential internal bleeding. "We need to move fast on this one." The rhythm of crisis medicine pulled Sarah deeper into familiar territory. Blood pressure readings and pupil response, the careful dance of assessment that separated salvageable cases from lost causes. She fell back into the role of Dr. Sarah Chen, trauma surgeon, whose confidence came from years of training and documented expertise. Yet beneath the surface competence, doubt gnawed at her like infection. If healing could happen through means she didn't understand, what did that mean for every child she'd failed to save? For Emma, whose injuries had been beyond surgical repair despite every technique Sarah knew, had there been other possibilities she'd never considered, other interventions that existed outside the boundaries of medical school curriculum? The questions felt dangerous, threatening to undermine the foundation that had sustained her through decades of impossible decisions. Medical science was reliable precisely because it acknowledged limitations. When treatment failed, it was because the damage exceeded current capabilities, not because the practitioner lacked faith or failed to see invisible helpers in empty corners. But Amira's small hand had been warm and real, her recovery undeniable. The other children's peaceful communion with something Sarah couldn't see had been witnessed by Hassan and Khalil, documented by machines that measured oxygen and pulse without regard for belief or skepticism. As Sarah worked to stabilize the girl's damaged arm, preparing for surgery that might save the limb or might end in amputation, she carried with her the terrible possibility that everything she'd built her identity upon was incomplete. That somewhere between scientific materialism and religious mysticism lay territory she'd never learned to navigate. And in that uncertainty, for the first time since Emma's death, Sarah Chen found herself wondering if her daughter's last question about heaven deserved a different answer than the one she'd given. The girl's pulse weakened under Sarah's fingertips, the familiar rhythm of impending shock demanding immediate action. In 30 years of surgery, Sarah had learned to trust the clarity that crisis brought, the way life or death decisions burned away everything except essential knowledge and trained reflexes. But today, as she reached for the scalpel that would either save this child's arm or begin its removal, her hand trembled with unprecedented uncertainty. There are different ways to heal people. Amira's words echoed through her mind, like a diagnosis she couldn't dismiss. Sarah had built her entire identity on the premise that healing came through scientific intervention, through understanding anatomy and pathology, through surgical precision and pharmaceutical protocols. It was a worldview that had sustained her through medical school, residency, decades of impossible cases where children lived or died based on her ability to apply documented techniques to damaged flesh. But what if that worldview was incomplete? The girl on the stretcher whimpered as Sarah began cleaning the wound, preparing to assess whether the bone fragments could be reconstructed, or if amputation was the only option to prevent systemic infection. It was the kind of decision that had defined her career, brutal choices made with clinical detachment because emotion compromised judgment. Yet as she worked, Sarah found herself unable to achieve that familiar distance. Instead, she thought of Emma's last conscious moments in the emergency room, when her daughter's eyes had searched her face with desperate trust. "Will you fix me, Mama?" The question that had shattered Sarah's professional composure because, for once, her medical expertise wasn't enough. No amount of surgical skill could repair the massive internal trauma from their car accident. No protocol existed for healing a mother's heart while her child slipped away despite every intervention modern medicine could provide. "The bleeding is slowing," Dr. Hassan observed from across the tent, working to stabilize the boy with chest injuries. "But we need to get him into surgery within the hour." Surgery. The answer they'd been trained to reach for when conservative treatment failed. Sarah had performed thousands of operations, each one a testament to human knowledge triumphing over the chaos of injury and disease. Her hands had guided scalpels through precise incisions, removed damaged tissue, reconnected severed vessels. She'd saved lives through the application of techniques learned in sterile operating rooms under fluorescent lights. But she'd also lost patients despite perfect execution of every documented procedure. Children whose injuries exceeded current medical capabilities, whose bodies couldn't survive the trauma despite flawless surgical intervention. She'd always accepted those losses as the inevitable limitations of science, tragic but unavoidable boundaries of human knowledge. Now, watching the monitors display stable vital signs for children who should be dying, Sarah confronted a possibility that terrified her more than any surgical complication. What if those boundaries were artificial? What if she'd been operating within a framework that excluded entire dimensions of healing? The girl's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Sarah's face with that universal expression of a child seeking comfort from adult competence. Sarah had seen that look thousands of times, the absolute faith that medical professionals would make everything better. Usually, it strengthened her resolve, reminded her of the sacred responsibility that came with surgical privileges. Today, it paralyzed her. Because behind the familiar trust in this stranger's eyes, Sarah saw Emma's face during their last conversation. Her daughter, weak from chemotherapy but still curious about everything, asking if heaven was real and whether people who died got to be with each other again. Sarah had deflected with her usual explanation about different beliefs and how nobody could know for certain what happened after death. She'd given her dying daughter scientific agnosticism when what Emma needed was hope. "Dr. Chen," Khalil's voice cut through her paralysis. "The girl's pressure is dropping again." The medical crisis demanded immediate action, but Sarah found herself frozen between two worlds. On one side lay everything she'd spent decades learning, the reliable territory of evidence-based medicine where outcomes correlated with intervention, where healing happened through documented mechanisms that could be studied and replicated. On the other side lay mystery, children speaking to invisible presences who somehow accelerated recovery beyond medical explanation. The possibility that healing involved forces she'd never acknowledged, never learned to recognize or work with. Territory that required abandoning the scientific certainty that had defined her identity since medical school. The choice felt absolute. She could retreat into familiar protocols, treat this girl's injuries with established procedures, and dismiss Amira's recovery as an anomaly best ignored. Return to the safety of medical materialism, where faith remained separate from practice, where she could maintain the careful, emotional distance that had allowed her to function since Emma's death. Or she could step forward into something unprecedented, accept that her understanding of healing might be fundamentally incomplete, allow for possibilities that medical school had never addressed, that surgical training had actively discouraged. Sarah looked across the tent to where Amira sat peacefully among the other children. Her recovery still impossible according to every textbook Sarah had memorized. The little girl's eyes held an invitation, not to abandon medical knowledge, but to expand beyond it. For the first time in 3 years, Dr. Sarah Chen made a choice based on faith rather than certainty. She opened her hands and stepped across the threshold. Tests and allies. The choice to step across an invisible threshold felt both profound and utterly inadequate when faced with a dying child. Sarah's hands still shook as she reached for the girl's wrist, checking the pulse that continued to weaken despite her philosophical breakthrough. Faith might have opened new possibilities, but it didn't automatically provide new techniques. The girl needed immediate intervention, and Sarah's expanded worldview offered no clear path between medical necessity and spiritual possibility. "Dr. Chen, she's going into shock," Khalil observed, his voice tight with concern. The boy had worked with her long enough to recognize the signs, the pale skin, rapid breathing, dropping blood pressure, that signaled the body's systems beginning to fail. Sarah nodded, muscle memory taking over as she reached for the 4 fluids. But as her hands moved through familiar motions, she found herself paying attention to details she'd previously dismissed. The way the girl's breathing seemed to synchronize with some rhythm beyond her own struggling lungs. The fact that her eyes remained focused and alert despite blood loss that should have clouded consciousness. Most significantly, Sarah noticed that the girl kept glancing toward the same corner where Amira claimed to see her invisible visitor. "Can you see him too?" Sarah asked quietly, the question feeling simultaneously absurd and necessary. The girl's eyes widened, then filled with tears. "You believe?" she whispered in accented English. "The others, they say children imagine things when hurt badly." Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Hassan appeared beside them, his expression grim. "We have a problem," he said, lowering his voice. "That boy with the chest injuries, his condition is deteriorating faster than it should. And I just got word that 3 more ambulances are en route. We're about to be completely overwhelmed." The brutal mathematics of crisis medicine crashed back over Sarah. Even with expanded possibilities, they were still 3 medical professionals with limited supplies facing an endless stream of casualties. Faith didn't create additional surgical instruments or multiply doses of antibiotics. Whatever new understanding she might be developing about healing, it had to function within the constraints of physical reality. "How long until the ambulances arrive?" she asked, her mind automatically shifting into triage mode. 20 minutes, maybe less," Hassan replied. "And these aren't minor injuries. According to the radio reports, it's multiple critical cases." Sarah looked around the tent, taking inventory. They had perhaps a dozen children currently under treatment, 3 of whom needed immediate surgery. With more critical cases arriving soon, they would face impossible decisions about resource allocation. The familiar weight of choosing who lived and who died settled over her shoulders like a lead blanket. But something had changed. For the first time since Emma's death, Sarah found herself considering variables beyond medical protocols. "Amira," she called softly to the little girl who sat watching from her cot. "Earlier, you said there are different ways to heal people. What did you mean?" The 8-year-old tilted her head, considering the question with the seriousness of an adult. "Sometimes bodies need medicine and surgery," she said carefully, "but sometimes people need other kinds of healing too, and sometimes—" She glanced toward the empty corner again. "Sometimes healing happens when people help each other in ways doctors don't learn in school." "That's very philosophical," Hassan said, his tone gentle but skeptical. "But it doesn't solve our immediate problem of too many patients and not enough resources." Sarah was about to agree when she noticed something remarkable happening around them. The other children, those who'd been sitting peacefully in that mysterious circle earlier, had begun moving closer to the newest casualties. The boy with bandaged eyes was holding the hand of a younger child whose leg was wrapped in blood-stained gauze. The twin sisters were singing something soft and melodic to a girl who'd been crying since arrival. What struck Sarah wasn't just their compassion, but the effect it seemed to be having. The crying girl had quieted. The boy with the leg injury had stopped the restless thrashing that usually accompanied severe pain. Throughout the tent, vital signs on the monitors were stabilizing in ways that made no medical sense. "Hassan," Sarah said slowly, "are you seeing what I'm seeing?" The older physician followed her gaze, his weathered face creasing in concentration. After 30 years of medicine, he'd learned to trust his observations even when they challenged his understanding. "The children are calming each other," he said finally, "and their responses are better than they should be." Khalil appeared beside them, his expression puzzled. "Dr. Chen, this is strange, but several of the pain medications seem to be lasting longer than normal, and some of the children are asking for reduced dosages." The sound of approaching sirens cut through their conversation, the wailing crescendo that announced the arrival of more broken bodies. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that preceded overwhelming crisis, but beneath it lay something new, curiosity about whether the healing she'd witnessed might somehow scale to meet greater need. As the first ambulance pulled up outside, Sarah realized she was about to discover the rules of this expanded world she'd chosen to enter. The ambulance doors burst open with the metallic crash that had become the soundtrack to Sarah's nightmares. Two paramedics rushed toward them, carrying a stretcher that held what remained of a boy who couldn't have been older than 10. His left leg was gone below the knee, the tourniquet applied in the field already soaked through with blood that continued to seep despite their efforts. "Massive trauma from debris," one paramedic shouted over the approaching sirens of the second ambulance. "Lost consciousness twice en route, BP dropping fast." Sarah's hands moved automatically toward the stretcher, but Hassan caught her arm. "We need to make decisions now," he said quietly. "Look at him, Sarah. Look at what we have to work with." She did look. In 30 years of trauma surgery, she'd developed the brutal ability to assess survivability within seconds. This boy's injuries were beyond their capabilities. Massive blood loss, likely internal trauma, shock setting in despite the 4 fluids they'd administered. Even in a fully equipped hospital, his chances would be marginal. In this makeshift clinic, with limited supplies and more casualties arriving every minute, attempting to save him would consume resources that might save 3 others. It was the mathematics of war medicine, cold and unforgiving. But as the paramedics transferred the boy to their treatment area, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. Amira had left her cot and was walking slowly toward the new arrival, her own recently healed wounds moving without pain or stiffness. She wasn't alone. Several of the other children were following her, including the boy with bandaged eyes who navigated the tense obstacles with impossible precision. "What are they doing?" Hassan muttered, his attention torn between medical protocols and the unfolding scene. Before Sarah could answer, the second ambulance arrived. Then the third. Bodies streamed past them in a blur of blood and torn clothing, children and adults whose injuries spoke of buildings collapsed, of shrapnel that had torn through crowds of civilians seeking shelter. The familiar chaos of mass casualty response threatened to overwhelm their small space completely. "Khalil, start triage assessments," Sarah called out, falling back into the rhythm of crisis management. "Hassan, take the chest trauma from earlier. He can't wait any longer. She stopped mid-sentence. Where chaos should have reigned, where the sound of pain and panic should have filled the air, an unexpected calm was settling over the tent. The children who'd been patients just hours ago were moving among the new arrivals with purpose and confidence that defied their own injuries. They weren't getting in the way of medical treatment. Instead, they seemed to be creating space for it to happen more effectively. The boy with the severed leg had stopped thrashing. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow with shock, was becoming deeper and more stable. The monitors attached to his chest showed vital signs that were still critical, but no longer in free fall. Sarah knelt beside him, checking the tourniquet and preparing for emergency surgery that would either stabilize him for transport, or become a futile final gesture. But as she worked, she became aware of Amira's presence beside her. The little girl wasn't interfering with medical procedures. She was simply there, one small hand resting gently on the boy's arm above his injuries. "He's scared," Amira said quietly. "He keeps thinking about his mother and wondering if she's looking for him." The boy's eyes fluttered open at her words, focusing on Amira's face with desperate recognition. He whispered something in Arabic that Sarah couldn't understand, but his entire body seemed to relax as Amira responded in the same language. "What did he say?" Sarah asked, her hands continuing to work on stabilizing his condition. "He wanted to know if he was going to die alone," Amira translated. "I told him that nobody dies alone here, that there are people watching over all of us even when we can't see them." The simplicity of the exchange struck Sarah like a physical blow. Here she'd been focused on medical interventions and resource allocation, on the brutal calculus of who could be saved and who was beyond help. But she'd forgotten the most basic human need in the face of trauma, the need not to be alone with fear. Around them, the other recovered children were providing the same quiet presence to new casualties, not interfering with medical treatment, but offering something equally essential: the comfort of connection, the assurance that suffering would be witnessed and shared rather than endured in isolation. Hassan looked up from his patient, his expression bewildered but hopeful. "Sarah, this is unprecedented. The boy's internal bleeding has slowed significantly. His pressure is stabilizing without surgical intervention." As more ambulances arrived outside, Sarah realized they were approaching something far more complex than she'd initially understood. This wasn't simply about choosing between science and faith, between medical intervention and spiritual healing. It was about discovering how both could work together in ways that traditional training had never explored. The real test was just beginning. The fourth ambulance arrived as Sarah knelt beside the boy with the severed leg, watching his impossible stabilization with a mixture of medical fascination and growing dread. Because if what she was witnessing was real, if healing could happen through mechanisms she'd never understood, then every patient she'd lost, every child who died under her hands, raised questions that threatened to destroy her, including Emma. "Dr. Chen," Hassan called urgently from across the tent. "We have a problem." Sarah looked up to see paramedics wheeling in a stretcher that made her blood freeze. The girl couldn't have been older than 7, her dark hair matted with blood, her small body broken in ways that mirrored every nightmare Sarah had carried for 3 years. The same positioning, the same type of head trauma, the same desperate fight for breath that Emma had struggled with in those final hours. Time collapsed. The Syrian clinic disappeared, replaced by sterile hospital corridors where Sarah had run alongside a gurney, carrying her own daughter, where she'd scrubbed in for surgery knowing that Emma's life depended on her surgical precision, her ability to remain objective in the face of ultimate personal stakes. She'd failed then. Despite 30 years of training, despite every technique memorized and perfected, despite love that would have moved mountains, she'd failed to save the one person who mattered most. Sarah Hassan's voice cut through her paralysis. "She's dying. We need to move now." The girl's vital signs were crashing, blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation falling, the cascade of system failures that Sarah recognized as irreversible decline. In any hospital, they would rush her to an operating room for emergency surgery that might buy minutes or hours but wouldn't change the inevitable outcome. But around them, the other children were gathering. Amira approached the stretcher with that same serene confidence, followed by the boy with bandaged eyes, the twins, others whose own miraculous recoveries had defied medical explanation. They formed a circle around the dying girl, their presence creating a pocket of inexplicable calm in the surrounding chaos. Sarah found herself facing the moment she'd dreaded since Emma's death. Another child whose life hung in the balance, another opportunity to fail when failure meant everything. "What do I do?" she whispered, the question directed at no one and everyone. Because for the first time in her career, she truly didn't know. The medical protocols were clear. emergency intervention, surgical repair of trauma, aggressive support of failing systems. But those same protocols had failed Emma, and they were failing children throughout the world every day. Yet here in this bombed clinic, children were healing through processes she couldn't name or control. Amira looked up at her with eyes that held impossible wisdom. "You know how to help her body," the little girl said gently. "But bodies aren't the only things that need healing." The monitors attached to the dying girl began showing patterns Sarah had never seen before. Not improvement exactly, but a kind of stabilization that suggested time, precious minutes or hours that might allow for intervention. Around the circle, the other children had grown very still, their attention focused on something Sarah couldn't see but could somehow sense. "Hassan," she said quietly, "prepare for emergency surgery, but also—" She paused, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. "Also trust that we're not working alone here." As they moved the girl toward their makeshift operating area, Sarah caught sight of the corner where Amira claimed to see her invisible visitor. For just a moment, the space seemed less empty than before, not a visible presence exactly, but an absence of absence. A suggestion that the boundaries between seen and unseen were more permeable than she'd ever imagined. The girl's eyes fluttered open as they positioned her for surgery. Despite her critical condition, despite blood loss that should have left her unconscious, she focused on Sarah's face with startling clarity. "Doctor," she whispered in English, her voice barely audible. "Am I going to be okay?" It was the question Emma had asked in those final hours, the question Sarah had answered with careful medical honesty about procedures and probabilities, about doing everything possible while preparing for various outcomes. Professional distance maintained even when her own heart was breaking. This time, looking into another dying child's eyes while surrounded by inexplicable healing and impossible recoveries, Sarah chose a different response. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said, taking the girl's small hand in both of hers. "But I promise you won't face it alone. And sometimes, when people aren't alone, healing happens in ways that surprise everyone." The girl's vital signs stabilized as Sarah began preparing for the most important surgery of her career, not because her techniques had improved, but because she was finally operating with her whole self-engaged scientific knowledge and faith, working together rather than in opposition. Outside, more ambulances approached through the Syrian night, carrying more broken bodies toward their small circle of expanding possibility. The scalpels slipped. For 30 years, Sarah's hands had moved with surgical precision that colleagues described as supernatural. She could operate in chaos, under pressure, through exhaustion and heartbreak. Her hands had never betrayed her, until now. The tiny nick in the 7-year-old's hepatic artery was microscopic, barely visible, but in a patient this fragile, it might as well have been a severed major vessel. Blood that they couldn't afford to lose began seeping into the abdominal cavity. The monitors erupted in urgent beeping as the girl's blood pressure plummeted. "Pressure," Sarah commanded, but her voice cracked. Hassan moved beside her, applying gauze, but they both knew the truth. In a fully equipped hospital, this would be manageable. Here, with their limited supplies and no blood bank, it was catastrophic. "Sarah," Hassan said quietly, his eyes meeting hers over their surgical masks. The unspoken message was clear. The girl was dying because of Sarah's mistake. Around them, the circle of children who had been maintaining their vigil began to shift restlessly. Amira's face showed confusion, then growing alarm as the monitor's urgent sounds filled the tent. The boy with bandaged eyes turned his unseeing gaze toward the corner where he claimed their invisible visitor sat, his expression puzzled. "He's gone," the boy whispered in English, his voice carrying disbelief. "He was here, but now—" Sarah's hands shook as she attempted to repair the damage she'd caused. Every technique in her arsenal felt clumsy, inadequate. The girl's life was flowing out through her fingers, and for the first time since arriving in Syria, the presence she'd begun to sense, that inexplicable source of healing that had surrounded them, felt absent. Dr. Chen. Khalil appeared beside the surgical table, his young face pale. The boy with the severed leg, his condition is deteriorating again. And the chest trauma patient. He swallowed hard. His lung is collapsing. The cascade of failures was beginning, as if whatever force had been sustaining their impossible string of recoveries had suddenly withdrawn, leaving them alone with inadequate resources and overwhelming need. The children who had been healing were sliding backward. New casualties were arriving faster than they could process them, and Sarah's own surgical skills, the one thing she'd always been able to rely on, were failing when it mattered most. Sarah Hassan's voice was gentle but urgent. "We're losing her." The 7-year-old's vital signs were crashing despite everything they tried. Her oxygen saturation was dropping, her heart rate becoming erratic. The same patterns Sarah had watched helplessly 3 years ago as Emma died despite every intervention medical science could offer. She'd thought something had changed. She'd believed that faith and science could work together, that healing might happen through forces beyond her understanding. She'd allowed herself to hope that this time, with this child who looked so much like Emma, the outcome might be different. Instead, her moment of faith had made her sloppy. Her surgical precision had failed precisely when she'd needed it most. "Time of death," Hassan began, his hand reaching toward his watch. "No." Sarah's voice was raw. "No, we don't stop. We keep trying." But even as she spoke, she could see the futility. The girl's pupils were fixed and dilated. The monitors showed the flat lines that marked the end of brain activity. Around them, other children were dying. Patients who might have been saved if Sarah hadn't wasted precious time and resources on a case that was beyond help from the beginning. The mathematical certainty of crisis medicine reasserted itself with brutal clarity. Limited resources, unlimited need, choices that guaranteed some would live and others would die. Faith couldn't change the fundamental equations. Hope couldn't create additional supplies or multiply surgical instruments. Amira approached the table, tears streaming down her face. "Dr. Sarah," she whispered, "why didn't it work this time?" The question pierced Sarah like a physical wound. Because for a few hours, she'd allowed herself to believe that healing might transcend the limitations she'd always accepted. She'd let hope override medical judgment, had trusted in possibilities that existed only in a traumatized child's imagination. The girl on the table could have been Emma. The same age, the same injuries, the same desperate fight for life. And just like with Emma, Sarah's best efforts hadn't been enough. Hassan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, we have more patients arriving. We need to make decisions." Through the tent opening, she could see ambulances lined up in the darkness, their red lights painting the night in urgent pulses. More broken bodies, more impossible choices, more opportunities for her inadequate skills to fail when failure meant death. The invisible presence that Amira claimed to see, if it had ever existed at all, had abandoned them when they needed it most. They were alone, with human limitations, in a world that demanded more than humans could give. Sarah looked at her hands, still stained with the blood of another child she'd failed to save. The same hands that had failed Emma. All seemed lost. Sarah stood frozen beside the table, staring at her blood-stained hands as the monitors flatlined with their relentless, accusatory tone. The 7-year-old's face, peaceful now in death, blurred through tears she refused to let fall. 3 years of running from this moment, from the memory of Emma's still form on a similar table, and she'd found herself right back where she'd started, helpless, inadequate, a surgeon whose precision failed when precision mattered most. But as she reached to turn off the monitors, something made her pause. The tent had grown quiet, not the oppressive silence of defeat, but something else, something expectant. "Dr. Sarah." Amira's small hand slipped into hers. "Look." Sarah followed the child's gaze to the corner where the invisible presence supposedly sat. She saw nothing but shadows and medical supplies, the same empty space that had mocked her desperate need to believe in something beyond her own failing abilities. "I don't see anything, Amira." Her voice was hollow. "There's nothing there, not with your eyes," Amira said gently. But you're looking for him in the wrong place." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Hassan's voice cut through her confusion. "Sarah, we need to—" He stopped abruptly, his attention caught by something behind her. She turned to see Khalil kneeling beside the boy with the severed leg, whose condition had been deteriorating. But the young medic wasn't performing any medical intervention. Instead, he was simply holding the child's hand, speaking quietly in Arabic, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "What is he doing?" Hassan whispered. As they watched, Khalil's patient visibly relaxed, his rapid breathing slowing to a more natural rhythm. The monitors showed stabilization that had nothing to do with medication or surgical repair. Across the tent, one of the twins had moved to sit beside the chest trauma patient, not touching his wounds but offering her presence, her refusal to let him suffer alone. "They're not healing them," Sarah breathed, understanding flooding through her like a physical force. "They're healing with them." The revelation hit her with the force of a surgical blade cutting away scar tissue. All this time, she'd been looking for some external force, some divine intervention that would make her medical skills sufficient, that would ensure her patient survived despite her human limitations. She'd been searching for a presence outside herself when the truth was far more complex. "I was looking for God in the wrong place," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Where?" Amira asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "I was looking for someone to save them despite me, to heal them in spite of my failures." Sarah's voice grew stronger as the pieces clicked into place. "But that's not how it works, is it?" She knelt beside the dead child, her hands automatically checking for vital signs that wouldn't return. But this time, instead of focusing on her failure to prevent death, she found herself seeing something else. The profound trust the girl had placed in her in those final moments. The way her fear had diminished, not because Sarah had promised a cure, but because she'd promised the child wouldn't face death alone. "When Emma was dying," Sarah continued, the words coming faster now, "I was so focused on saving her that I forgot to simply be with her. I was performing surgery on my daughter, not comforting a frightened child who needed her mother." The memory that had tormented her for 3 years shifted, revealing details she'd pushed away in her guilt and self-recrimination. Emma asking if the surgery would hurt, Sarah explaining procedures instead of simply saying she'd be right there when Emma woke up. The distance she'd maintained even in those final hours, believing that emotional detachment would somehow make her medical intervention more effective. "I thought faith meant believing God would fix everything," Sarah said, looking around the tent where human connection was creating space for healing that transcended medical intervention. "But that's not faith. That's just expectation." Amira nodded solemnly. "Faith is being willing to sit with someone in the hard places, to share the hurt so they don't carry it alone." Hassan approached slowly, his expression showing the same dawning recognition. "The children who healed," he said quietly, "they weren't just physically treated, they were seen, acknowledged, their fear was witnessed and shared." Sarah stood, understanding flooding through her with painful clarity. The invisible presence Amira saw wasn't separate from their work. It was woven through it, present in every moment of genuine connection, every choice to remain present with suffering rather than retreating into professional distance. "The healing isn't separate from the medicine," she breathed. "It is the medicine. Connection, presence, refusing to let people face their darkest moments alone." Outside, more ambulances approached, carrying casualties that would test every skill she possessed. But, for the first time since Emma's death, Sarah felt ready to meet them, not as a surgeon seeking redemption through perfect technique, but as a human being willing to sit with others in their pain. The revelation changed everything. The ambulances arrived in a steady stream through the pre-dawn darkness, their headlights cutting through the Syrian night like searching fingers. Sarah stood at the tent entrance, watching the procession of human suffering approach, but something fundamental had shifted in how she saw it all. Where once she'd felt the familiar tightening of professional anxiety, The mental calculations of resources versus need, the grim mathematics of crisis medicine. Now she felt something else entirely. Purpose. 12 casualties incoming, Hassan reported, checking his tablet. Multiple blast injuries, severe trauma. 3 children among them. Sarah nodded, turning back to survey their makeshift medical facility with new eyes. The tent that had seemed impossibly inadequate just hours ago now looked different, not because their supplies had multiplied or their equipment had improved, but because she finally understood what they were actually doing here. "Khalil," she called to the young medic who was still sitting with the chest trauma patient. "How is Ahmad's breathing?" "Steady," Khalil replied, not moving from his position beside the boy. "His oxygen saturation has improved significantly in the last hour." Sarah nodded. The boy's medical chart would show pain medication and wound care, but she could see the real intervention happening. Khalil's quiet presence, his willingness to stay close when everything in Ahmad's world had become uncertain and terrifying. "Hassan," Sarah said, moving to the supply cabinet, "I want to try something different with the incoming casualties." He looked up from organizing surgical instruments, eyebrows raised. "Different how?" "Pair each patient with one of our recovered children, not for medical treatment, for presence, for connection." She paused, knowing how it must sound. "I know it goes against every protocol we've learned, but I think we've been treating symptoms while missing the actual disease." Hassan studied her face in the harsh fluorescent light. 3 days ago, he might have questioned her judgment. Now, after witnessing recoveries that defied medical explanation, he simply nodded. "The disease being isolation," he said quietly. "The belief that they have to face their pain alone." "Exactly." Sarah felt something loosening in her chest, a tension she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten it was there. We've been so focused on fixing bodies that we forgot people aren't just collections of organs and tissues. They're beings who heal in relationship. Amira approached, her small face serious. "Dr. Sarah, the new people coming, they're very scared. I can see it from here." Sarah knelt to the child's eye level, struck again by the wisdom that seemed to emanate from such a young face. "Can you help them? Can you show them they're not alone?" "We all can," Amira said, gesturing to the other children who had gathered around them. The boy with bandaged eyes, the twins, Ahmad despite his chest tubes, even some of the newer arrivals who had found their own healing in connection and presence. "That's what he told us to do." "He?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to understand that the identity of Amira's invisible visitor mattered less than what his presence represented. "He said that whenever people choose to sit with each other in hard places, he's there too, in the sitting, in the choosing not to leave someone alone with their fear." The first ambulance pulled up outside, its back doors already opening to reveal a scene of organized chaos. Paramedics shouting medical details, monitors beeping urgently, the familiar symphony of trauma care. But as Sarah walked out to meet them, she carried with her a plan that would have seemed impossible just hours ago. "Hassan, establish triage as usual," she called over the noise. "But I want each patient assigned a companion, someone who stays with them throughout treatment, not for medical intervention, but for presence." "Sarah," Hassan said quietly, "you realize this could be seen as highly unorthodox. If word gets back to the medical authorities—" "Let them come," Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Let them see what happens when we treat the whole person instead of just the injuries." As the first stretcher approached, a boy perhaps 10 years old, his leg severely damaged by shrapnel, Sarah made a choice that 3 years ago would have been unthinkable. Instead of immediately focusing on his wounds, she knelt beside his head, making eye contact with terrified brown eyes that reminded her painfully of Emma's. "What's your name?" she asked in careful Arabic. "Samir," he whispered, his voice barely audible over his rapid breathing. "Samir, I'm Dr. Sarah. I'm going to take care of your leg, but first I want you to meet someone." She gestured to Ahmad, who despite his own injuries was approaching on unsteady feet. "Ahmad understands what you're feeling right now. He's going to stay with you while I work, okay? The change in Samir's vital signs was almost immediate. His breathing slowed, his heart rate decreased. Not because of any medical intervention, but because he was no longer alone with his terror. Around them, the other children began moving toward the incoming casualties with purpose and compassion that took Sarah's breath away. They had become healers, not through medical training, but through their willingness to share in suffering rather than turn away from it. For the first time since Emma's death, Sarah felt like she was practicing medicine the way it was meant to be practiced, in community, in connection, in the profound recognition that healing happens in relationship. The work continued through the night, with an intensity Sarah had never experienced. Each new patient brought their own constellation of trauma, physical, emotional, spiritual, and each was met not just with medical intervention, but with the radical presence of those who had walked similar paths of suffering. By sunrise, word had spread beyond their small clinic. Sarah first noticed the change when Dr. Rahman from the main hospital arrived unannounced, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something approaching bewilderment. "Dr. Chen," he said, surveying the tent where children sat beside adult patients, where healing seemed to happen through connection as much as surgery. "We've been receiving reports, highly unusual reports." Sarah wiped her hands on a towel, meeting his gaze steadily. 3 years ago, even 3 days ago, she would have felt defensive, would have immediately begun explaining her methods in acceptable medical terminology. Now she simply waited. "The recovery rates you're achieving here," Rahman continued, "they're statistically impossible given your resources. The psychological stability of your patients, their pain management outcomes." He paused, watching as Amira helped comfort a newly arrived teenager whose burns covered most of his left arm. "What exactly are you doing differently?" "We're not abandoning medical science," Sarah said carefully. "We're expanding it." Hassan joined them, carrying charts that documented their recent cases. "Dr. Rahman, I've been tracking our outcomes for the past 72 hours. The data is remarkable, but it's also problematic." Sarah felt her stomach clench. "Problematic how?" "Word has reached Damascus. The Ministry of Health is sending an investigation team. They want to understand our methods, but more importantly," Hassan lowered his voice, "they want to determine if we're following proper protocols." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. An investigation would mean scrutiny, documentation, justification for every unconventional choice she'd made. It would mean explaining the invisible presence, the children acting as healers, the complete integration of emotional and spiritual care with medical treatment. It would mean the end of everything they'd built here. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning. A full medical review board." Sarah looked around the tent, seeing it suddenly through the eyes of medical bureaucrats. The unofficial patient assignments, children providing what could be construed as medical comfort without proper training or oversight. Treatment protocols that prioritize psychological healing alongside physical intervention. From their perspective, it would look like chaos, dangerous deviation from established care standards. "We could modify our approach," Hassan suggested quietly. "Separate the medical treatment from the other interventions, make it look more conventional." But even as he spoke, Sarah could see it wouldn't work. The healing they'd witnessed wasn't happening despite their unconventional methods. It was happening because of them. The integration of presence and medicine, the refusal to treat symptoms while ignoring the human being experiencing them, the recognition that trauma affected more than just bodies. "No," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "We don't change anything." Rahman stared at her. "Dr. Chen, I understand you've had some success here. But if the review board determines you've been operating outside acceptable medical standards, then they'll shut us down," Sarah finished. "I understand the consequences." But as she spoke, she realized something profound had shifted within her. The fear that had driven her for 3 years, fear of failure, of inadequacy, of making the wrong choice under pressure, had been replaced by something stronger, not confidence in her medical abilities, though those remained, but conviction, about what healing actually required. She thought of Emma, of those final hours when Sarah's desperate focus on surgical intervention had prevented her from simply being present as a mother. She thought of Samir, whose vital signs had stabilized not from medication, but from Ahmad's willingness to share in his fear. "Dr. Rahman," she said, "what if everything we've been taught about the boundaries between medical and emotional care is wrong? What if the separation between treating bodies and treating people is artificial? That's not how medicine works, Dr. Chen, isn't it?" Sarah gestured toward their patients, where the impossible was happening daily. "What if we've been so focused on maintaining professional distance that we've forgotten medicine is fundamentally about human connection, about refusing to let people face their darkest moments alone?" Rahman looked uncomfortable. "The review board won't be interested in philosophy, Dr. Chen. They'll want documented protocols, measurable outcomes, justification for every deviation from standard care." Sarah nodded, understanding that tomorrow would bring the confrontation she'd been unconsciously preparing for since Emma's death. Not just with medical authorities, but with the fundamental question of what she believed healing required. She would not compromise what they'd discovered here. Not for career preservation, not for professional acceptance, not even for the safety of continuing their work without scrutiny. The stakes were clear now. Tomorrow she would defend not just her methods, but her conviction that medicine without presence was merely mechanics, that healing without relationship was impossible. She was committed to seeing this through, regardless of the cost. The review board arrived at dawn in 3 black sedans, their engines cutting through the morning stillness like scalpels through flesh. Sarah stood at the tent entrance, watching 5 figures in crisp suits emerge into the dust and chaos of the refugee camp, their faces already set in expressions of professional skepticism. "Dr. Chen?" The lead investigator approached, his Arabic accent precise and clipped. "I am Dr. Mansour from the Ministry of Health. We're here to conduct a comprehensive review of your medical practices." Behind him, the other board members were already surveying the tent with calculating eyes. Sarah could see them cataloguing every deviation from standard protocol: children sitting with adult patients, the absence of proper isolation barriers, treatment areas that prioritize comfort over sterile procedure. "Of course," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Would you like to begin with our patient files?" "We'll begin with an immediate suspension of all non-standard activities," Dr. Mansour announced, loud enough for everyone in the tent to hear. "Until we can verify proper medical protocols are being followed, all patient companions must be removed, all unauthorized personnel cleared from treatment areas." The words hit the tent like a physical blow. Sarah watched as Khalil looked up from where he sat with a young girl recovering from surgery, confusion and hurt crossing his face. Amira, who had been reading to an elderly man with severe burns, slowly closed her book. "Dr. Mansour," Sarah said carefully, "these companions aren't interfering with medical care. If anything, our patient outcomes have—" "Dr. Chen," his voice carried the authority of institutional power, "you're currently under investigation for multiple violations of established medical protocol: children providing medical comfort without supervision, patients receiving treatment outside standard triage procedures, emotional intervention integrated with medical care without proper psychological certification." He gestured toward Amira, who was still holding the old man's hand. "This appears to be a fundamental confusion about the boundaries of medical practice." Sarah felt 3 years of institutional conditioning rise in her throat. The automatic impulse to defer, to apologize, to find compromise positions that might preserve some fragment of what they'd built here. But as she watched the fear returning to her patients' faces, as she saw the children beginning to withdraw from connections that had brought profound healing, something crystallized within her. "No," she said quietly. Dr. Mansour paused in his clipboard notation. "Excuse me?" "No." Sarah stepped forward, her voice growing stronger. "You want to observe our methods? Then observe them as they actually work, not some sanitized version designed to fit institutional expectations. The tent had gone silent. Hassan was staring at her with a mixture of admiration and terror. The other board members exchanged glances that clearly questioned Sarah's mental stability. "Dr. Chen," Dr. Mansour said, his tone shifting toward warning, "you seem to be under the impression that you have a choice here. This is an official investigation. You will comply with standard medical protocols, or this facility will be closed immediately." Sarah looked around the tent, seeing it through new eyes. Not through the lens of professional preservation or career safety, but through the recognition of what was actually at stake here. The boy whose nightmares had stopped when other children shared their own stories of survival. The woman whose infected wounds had healed after weeks of failed antibiotic treatment, turning around only when she found community among fellow trauma survivors. The profound medicine of being truly seen, genuinely accompanied, radically accompanied in the darkest places of human experience. "Dr. Mansour," she said, surprised by the calm that had settled over her 3 days ago, "I would have agreed with everything you're saying. I've spent my entire career believing that medicine required emotional distance, that effectiveness demanded professional isolation, that healing happened through technique rather than relationship." She gestured toward Amira, who, despite the investigator's presence, had quietly returned to the old man's bedside. "But I've learned something here that challenges every assumption I've held about what medicine actually is." "And what's that?" Dr. Mansour asked, his voice heavy with skepticism. "That healing is fundamentally relational, that the separation between treating bodies and treating people is not just artificial, it's actively harmful." Sarah felt every word as she spoke it, the conviction rising from some deep place she'd barely known existed. That medicine without presence, without genuine human connection, without the willingness to sit with people in their darkest moments. That's not medicine at all. That's just elaborate mechanics. The silence stretched taut between them. Sarah could feel Hassan holding his breath, could sense the children watching with the profound attention they brought to moments when adult choices would determine their future. Dr. Mansour straightened, his expression hardening into institutional authority. "Dr. Chen, you have precisely one opportunity to cooperate with this investigation, comply with standard protocols, or face immediate closure and professional consequences." Sarah looked at him steadily, every lesson of the past 3 days crystallizing into absolute clarity about what mattered most. "Then you'll have to close us down," she said quietly, "because I won't compromise what we've discovered here. Not for institutional approval, not for professional safety, not even to continue operating." The ultimate test had begun. The confrontation erupted with the swift brutality of medical bureaucracy unleashed. "Security," Dr. Mansour barked into his radio. "I need immediate assistance at the refugee medical facility. We have a non-compliant physician refusing to follow direct orders." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, but she remained motionless as chaos exploded around her. Hassan stepped forward, his face pale with terror. "Dr. Chen, please, reconsider. We can find another way." "There is no other way," Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through the rising panic. "Don't you see? This is exactly the moment Emma was trying to prepare me for." Dr. Mansour's eyes narrowed. "Who is Emma? Another unauthorized staff member?" The question detonated something primal within Sarah. 3 years of suppressed grief, guilt, and professional shame crystallized into pure fury. "Emma was my daughter. She died because I was so focused on surgical protocols that I forgot to be her mother in her final moments. Just like you're so focused on institutional control that you're blind to actual healing happening right in front of you. Dr. Chen, you're clearly experiencing emotional instability." "No," Sarah's voice rose to fill the tent. "I'm experiencing clarity. For the first time in 3 years, I can see the difference between practicing medicine and practicing institutional fear." Around them, the confrontation was expanding beyond words. 2 security officers had arrived, their hands resting on restraint equipment. The board members were photographing everything, documenting what they would undoubtedly classify as a complete professional breakdown. But the children were not retreating. Ahmad, despite his injuries, moved to stand beside Sarah. Then Khalil, still weak from surgery. The twins, holding hands, positioned themselves between the investigators and their patients. Within moments, every child in the tent had formed a protective circle around the connections they'd built, not just around Sarah, but around the radical medicine of presence they'd discovered together. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Dr. Mansour declared, gesturing at the scene with disgust. "Children involved in medical situations beyond their comprehension, emotional manipulation disguised as treatment, complete abandonment of professional boundaries." Sarah looked at Amira, who had not moved from the old man's bedside despite the chaos. The child was singing softly in Arabic, the same melody she'd hummed during her own healing days ago. Other patients had begun joining in, their voices weak but determined. "Dr. Mansour," Sarah said, her voice now absolutely steady, "you want to see emotional manipulation? It's the lie we tell ourselves that distance equals professionalism, that efficiency requires isolation, that healing can happen without relationship." She gestured toward her patients, whose vital signs monitors showed the concrete impact of fear as their support systems were threatened. "Look at what your protocols are actually producing." The security officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." But Hassan suddenly moved between them and Sarah, his face transformed by desperate courage. "Wait, just wait." He turned to Dr. Mansour, pulling out a thick folder of charts. "Before you make any final decisions, look at our actual medical outcomes. Mr. Hassan, this isn't about infection rates down 60%, Hassan continued, his voice growing stronger. Pain medication requirements reduced by half. Post-traumatic stress indicators improved beyond anything in the literature. Recovery times that shouldn't be possible given our resource limitations." He held up chart after chart. "This isn't philosophy, Dr. Mansour. This is data." Dr. Mansour reluctantly took the files, his expression shifting slightly as he scanned the documented outcomes. The other board members gathered around, their official skepticism beginning to crack against undeniable evidence. "These numbers," one of them murmured. "How is this possible with such limited medical equipment?" "Because healing isn't just medical," Sarah said, seizing the moment of uncertainty. "Because human beings aren't just collections of symptoms requiring isolated treatment, because presence itself has therapeutic value that we've systematically trained ourselves to ignore." The tent fell silent except for the continued singing, which had now spread to include patients throughout the space. Even the most severely injured were adding their voices to the melody that spoke of connection, of refusing to face darkness alone. Dr. Mansour looked up from the charts, his institutional certainty visibly wavering. "Dr. Chen, even if these outcomes are impressive, the methods are still highly irregular. We cannot endorse practices that haven't been properly studied, validated through controlled trials." "Then study them," Sarah interrupted. "But don't destroy them in the name of validation. Don't sacrifice actual healing for the illusion of control." The confrontation hung suspended between two worldviews, the institutional demand for quantifiable safety versus the profound evidence of medicine practiced as radical presence. Around them, children continued holding space for healing that transcended any protocol, their commitment unwavering despite the adult chaos threatening to tear apart everything they'd built together. Sarah stood at the center of the storm, finally understanding that this moment would define not just her career, but her fundamental relationship with what it meant to heal. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, institutional power confronting transformational truth in the space between heartbeats. Sarah felt the weight of 3 years pressing against this single choice, the choice that would determine not just her future, but the future of every connection forged in this tent. Dr. Mansour's radio crackled with urgent static. "Sir, we have additional personnel en route, ministry officials, potential media presence. This situation is escalating beyond medical review. Sarah understood immediately. Her defiance had triggered something larger than a simple protocol violation. She was challenging the entire medical establishment's fundamental assumptions about healing, and they would respond with overwhelming force to protect their institutional authority. "Dr. Chen," Dr. Mansour said, his voice carrying new gravity, "this is your final opportunity. Stand down, accept remedial training, and we can classify this as a temporary aberration due to field stress. Continue this resistance, and you'll face permanent revocation of your medical license, criminal charges for endangering patients, and complete professional destruction." The words hit like surgical instruments, cutting through her remaining illusions. Sarah realized she had been unconsciously hoping for compromise, for some way to preserve both her career and her convictions. But standing here, watching Amira continue singing to the wounded man despite the chaos around them, she finally understood what Emma had been trying to teach her. Some truths required total commitment. "Hassan," she said quietly, turning to her colleague whose face showed pure terror at what was unfolding. "Take over the medical protocols. Document everything according to standard procedures. Protect the staff who have families, careers, futures to consider. Dr. Chen, what are you—" "I'm making sure this place survives," Sarah interrupted. "But I won't compromise what we've discovered here, not even to preserve it." She moved toward the center of the tent, where the children had maintained their protective circle despite the mounting adult chaos. Kneeling beside Amira, Sarah placed her hand gently on the child's shoulder. "Keep singing," she whispered. "No matter what happens next, remember that healing happens through connection, that medicine without love is just mechanics. That presence itself is therapeutic." Amira looked up, her dark eyes holding wisdom far beyond her years. "Dr. Sarah, are you leaving?" The question cut deeper than any scalpel. Sarah realized that in choosing to protect what they'd built, she was simultaneously destroying her ability to participate in it. The sacrifice required wasn't just professional, it was personal, relational, cutting to the core of everything she'd learned about healing. "I have to," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "So that you can stay, so that this continues." She stood, turning back to Dr. Mansour, whose expression had shifted to something resembling professional pity. "Dr. Chen, you're destroying your entire career over what? Some idealistic notion that medicine should be emotional? This is a tragic waste of excellent surgical training." "No," Sarah said, finally understanding what victory actually required. "This is the first medical decision I've made in 3 years that isn't driven by fear." The security officers moved forward, but Sarah raised her hand. "I'll come willingly, but I want something documented in your report." Dr. Mansour paused, clearly expecting some final plea for professional mercy. "Document that on the day this facility was investigated, infection rates were 60% below regional averages. That pain medication requirements had dropped by half. That children who hadn't spoken since experiencing trauma were singing together." Sarah's voice grew stronger with each word. "Document that healing happens when we refuse to let people face their darkest moments alone, and that any medical system that doesn't account for that fundamental truth is practicing elaborate mechanics, not medicine." The tent had gone completely silent except for Amira's continued singing. Even the investigators seemed momentarily frozen by the recognition that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a physician choosing principles over professional survival with absolute clarity about the cost. "Dr. Chen," Dr. Mansour said finally, "you do understand that this decision will effectively end your medical career?" Sarah looked around the tent one final time, seeing it not as a place she was losing, but as proof of what became possible when healing was approached as radical presence rather than institutional protocol. The children would continue their work. Hassan would maintain the medical standards that allowed the facility to operate. The profound medicine of connection would survive because she had refused to compromise it for professional safety. "Dr. Mansour," she said, moving toward the security officers with surprising peace, "I understand that this decision is just beginning my medical career, For the first time, I know what healing actually requires." As they led her from the tent, Sarah heard the singing spread beyond the children to include patients throughout the space, voices joining together in the melody that spoke of refusing to face darkness alone. The sound followed her like a benediction, confirmation that some victories could only be achieved through total sacrifice of everything that had seemed important before. Behind her, the work would continue. The medicine of presence would survive. And for the first time since Emma's death, Sarah Chen knew she had chosen love over fear, the resolution. The detention facility was nothing like Sarah had expected, a sterile government building where she spent 18 hours in bureaucratic limbo while officials decided what to do with a surgeon who had committed the apparently unprecedented crime of refusing to abandon relational medicine. Through the single window, she could see the distant glow of fires that marked the refugee camps, wondering if Hassan had managed to maintain operations, if the children were still singing. The door opened to reveal Dr. Mansour, his expression unreadable as he carried a thick folder of documents. "Dr. Chen, we need to discuss the situation." Sarah straightened, prepared for formal charges, deportation proceedings, the complete destruction of her medical credentials. "I understand. What's the timeline for—" "The facility hasn't been shut down," Dr. Mansour interrupted, setting the folder on the metal table between them. "In fact, the Ministry of Health wants to designate it as a pilot program." The words hit Sarah like a physical impact. "What?" Dr. Mansour opened the folder, revealing dozens of photographs, data charts, and what appeared to be testimony statements. "After you were removed yesterday, something unprecedented happened. Every major news outlet in the region picked up the story of a surgeon choosing patients over professional safety. But more importantly, we received documentation we hadn't seen before." He spread photographs across the table, images of the tent facility taken over the past weeks, showing children engaged in healing activities, patients participating in communal recovery, the profound transformation of trauma into connection. Mr. Hassan had been documenting everything apparently, including video testimony from patients about their recovery experiences. Sarah stared at evidence of work she'd barely recognized as she was living it. In the photographs, she could see what the investigators had witnessed, medicine practiced as radical presence, healing that transcended any protocol she'd learned in medical school. The infection rates, pain management outcomes, psychological recovery indicators. Dr. Mansour continued, his voice carrying a reluctant respect. "Dr. Chen, these results exceed anything we've seen in conventional refugee medical care. The ministry officials want to understand how you achieved them." "It wasn't me," Sarah said automatically. "It was the children, the patients themselves, the recognition that healing happens through relationship, not just treatment." Dr. Mansour studied her carefully. "Yes, well, that's what makes this complicated." He pulled out an official-looking document. "They want you to return, to oversee an expanded program that incorporates these methods into official medical protocols." The irony was staggering. 24 hours ago, Sarah had sacrificed her career to protect medicine practiced as connection. Now the same institutional system that had rejected her was offering to legitimize everything she'd discovered, but on their terms, within their control, subject to their oversight. "What would that look like?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Structured implementation, controlled studies, measured integration of emotional support components into standard medical care." Dr. Mansour's tone suggested he was reciting approved language. "Everything you developed, but with proper supervision and documentation." Sarah looked at the photographs again, seeing Amira teaching other children to sing through their fear, Ahmad helping younger patients understand their injuries, the profound medicine of presence that had emerged when healing was approached as fundamentally relational. She tried to imagine that spontaneous connection channeled through institutional protocols, that organic community measured and controlled for research purposes. "No," she said quietly. Dr. Mansour's eyebrows rose. "Dr. Chen, this is an extraordinary opportunity. Full reinstatement, expanded resources, the chance to influence medical policy throughout the region, built on the assumption that what we discovered can be systematized without being destroyed. Sarah met his gaze steadily. But connection can't be protocolized. Presence can't be institutionalized. The moment you try to control it, you've already lost what made it effective. Through the window, she could see the first light of dawn touching the distant camps. Somewhere in those tents, Hassan was probably checking on patients. Children were continuing their work of accompanying each other through trauma. The radical medicine of refusing to let anyone face darkness alone was surviving without her oversight. "Then what do you want?" Dr. Mansour asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Sarah realized the question had a simple answer that would have been incomprehensible to her just days ago. "I want to go home, to my daughter's grave, to finally tell her that I understand what she was trying to teach me." She stood, leaving the folder of documentation on the table. "But I want Hassan to continue the work without institutional interference. Give him the resources he needs and trust him to maintain what we built there." Dr. Mansour stared at her as if she'd spoken in an unknown language. "You're walking away from everything. Again." "No," Sarah said, moving toward the door with surprising lightness. "I'm walking toward everything. For the first time, I know what healing actually requires. And I know that some truths can only be lived, not systematized." As she left the detention facility, Sarah carried with her the sound of children's voices joining together, the profound medicine of presence, and the absolute certainty that love expressed as radical accompaniment could survive any institutional attempt to control it. The real work was just beginning. The flight home stretched across 14 hours of mechanical time that felt both endless and insufficient for the magnitude of transformation Sarah carried within her chest. She pressed her forehead against the airplane window, watching continents shift beneath clouds, understanding that the geography below was no more altered than the landscape of her own heart. Boston's skyline appeared through winter haze, exactly as she'd left it 3 weeks ago, but Sarah felt like an archaeological discovery of herself, unearthed, examined, fundamentally reconstructed. The customs officer stamped her passport with routine indifference, unaware that the woman returning bore little resemblance to the one who had departed. The cemetery was her first destination. Sarah stood at the taxi window, directing the driver through streets that seemed simultaneously familiar and foreign, as if she were viewing her former life through thick glass that distorted everything into shapes that almost made sense. Emma's grave sat beneath 2 feet of fresh snow, the headstone barely visible. Sarah knelt without regard for the cold seeping through her jeans, brushing away the white accumulation with bare hands that had learned to touch suffering without flinching. "I met her, baby," Sarah whispered to the stone that bore her daughter's name. "I met the little girl you were trying to show me. Her name is Amira, and she taught me that healing happens when we refuse to let anyone face darkness alone." The words crystallized in the winter air, visible proof of breath and life, and the absolute certainty that love transcended every boundary she had constructed around her grief. Sarah realized she was no longer speaking to memory, but to presence, Emma's spirit woven into every lesson about connection she had learned in that bombed-out tent halfway around the world. "I understand now why you kept asking if the other children in the hospital were scared, why you wanted me to sit with them instead of just treating them." Sarah's voice grew stronger, echoing off headstones that stood as monuments to other loves that refused to be contained by death. "You were teaching me that medicine without relationship is just elaborate mechanics." Snow began falling again, soft flakes that landed on Sarah's shoulders like gentle benedictions. She felt Emma's presence not as the absence she had carried for 3 years, but as the guiding wisdom that had led her across continents to discover what healing actually required. The sound of footsteps crunching through snow made Sarah turn. Dr. James Morrison, her former colleague and closest friend before grief had made relationship too painful to maintain, approached with the careful hesitancy of someone unsure of their welcome. "Sarah, I heard you were back." James stopped several feet away, his breath visible in the cold air. "I've been following the news coverage. What you did in Syria." "What I discovered in Syria," Sarah corrected, standing to face the friend she had pushed away in her desperate attempt to avoid any reminder of loss. "James, I owe you an apology. When I shut you out after Emma died, I was operating from the belief that connection only amplified pain. I was wrong." James stepped closer, his expression shifting from cautious concern to something approaching recognition. "You look different. Not just tired from travel, but fundamentally different." Sarah nodded, understanding that the change was visible in ways that transcended physical appearance. "I learned that presence itself is therapeutic, that the isolation I thought was protecting me was actually preventing healing, both mine and everyone I refused to let close." They stood together in the falling snow, two people who had shared the intensity of trauma surgery for years before grief had driven Sarah into professional exile. Sarah felt the profound difference in her capacity to hold both loss and connection simultaneously, to love without the terror of inevitable ending. "I want to tell you about her," Sarah said, surprising herself with the words. "About Emma, about what she was trying to teach me, about why losing her nearly destroyed my ability to practice medicine." James's eyes widened. In 3 years, Sarah had never spoken Emma's name in his presence, had treated any mention of her daughter as an unbearable invasion of carefully maintained emotional distance. "I'd like that," he said softly. "I'd like that very much." As they walked together toward the cemetery gates, Sarah began sharing the story of a little girl who had understood instinctively what medical school had never taught, that healing required relationship, that presence itself possessed therapeutic power, that medicine practiced without love was merely technical intervention that missed the heart of human suffering. Behind them, Emma's grave rested beneath fresh snow, no longer a monument to unbearable loss, but a foundation stone for the radical medicine of connection that Sarah now carried forward into a world desperate for healing that acknowledged the profound interconnectedness of all human hearts. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time, Sarah knew she would not be doing it alone. The new beginning. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the converted warehouse space in Boston's South End, watching 12-year-old Marcus teach a group of younger children how to breathe through their fear. The Community Healing Center occupied 3,000 square feet of what had once been industrial storage, now transformed into an integrated medical and wellness space, where treatment protocols included trained emotional support from peers who had survived similar traumas. Dr. Chen, "Lucia's asking for you," called Maria Santos, the center's family advocate whose own daughter had been lost to street violence 2 years ago. Sarah nodded, finishing her notes on the antibiotic course she'd just prescribed for 8-year-old David, whose asthma had improved dramatically since joining the peer support circles. Lucia sat in the corner space they'd designated for difficult conversations, her leg still in a cast from the car accident that had killed her older brother 3 weeks ago. At 9, she carried the particular hollow expression Sarah recognized in children who had witnessed the sudden transformation of ordinary moments into unbearable loss. "I keep thinking I see him," Lucia whispered, as Sarah settled beside her on the floor cushions. "Miguel, in places where he can't be. Is that crazy?" Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had once driven her to maintain careful emotional distance. But now she breathed into the sensation until it transformed into something approaching sacred space. "Tell me about where you see him." "At school yesterday, I thought he was sitting in the cafeteria at our usual table, and this morning I could swear he was in the back seat when Mom was driving me here." Lucia's voice carried the careful tone of a child testing whether adults could handle her truth. "But when I look directly, there's nothing there." Sarah nodded, remembering Amira's certainty about the presence she'd conversed with in that bombed-out clinic, the way other children had gathered around the same space without prompting. "What does it feel like when you see him?" Lucia considered this carefully, like he's trying to tell me something important. "But I can't hear what." "Maybe," Sarah said gently, The seeing itself is what he's trying to tell you. That love doesn't disappear when people die. That connection continues in ways we don't always understand. Across the room, Marcus was leading the breathing exercise Sarah had learned from watching Amira calm terrified children through their medical procedures. The technique had no official name in any textbook, but Sarah had documented its effectiveness in reducing both anxiety and pain medication requirements among their young patients. "Dr. Chen, would you sit with me while I try to see him again?" Lucia asked. "I'm scared to look, but I think I need to." Sarah positioned herself so that Lucia could lean against her shoulder, providing the physical grounding of presence while the child navigated territory that existed beyond medical training. Together, they sat in comfortable silence, Sarah's breathing naturally synchronizing with Lucia's until both their nervous systems had shifted into the regulated calm that made difficult emotional work possible. There, Lucia breathed after several minutes. "He's sitting by the art supply table. He looks peaceful." Sarah followed the child's gaze to the space where children often worked through trauma by creating visual representations of their experiences. She saw only empty chairs and scattered crayons, but felt the profound truth that healing often required acknowledging realities that transcended purely physical observation. "What do you want to tell him?" Sarah asked. Lucia was quiet for a long moment, her small body relaxing against Sarah's side. "That I miss him, that I'm scared without him, but that I'm learning how to be brave from the other kids here." The afternoon continued with its rhythm of integrated care, Sarah removing stitches from a child whose surgical site had healed with remarkable speed due to consistent emotional support, Maria facilitating a family meeting where parents learned to recognize trauma symptoms, Marcus and 2 other peer counselors helping newcomers understand that their reactions to loss were normal responses to abnormal circumstances. At 6 o'clock, Sarah locked the center's front door and walked the 12 blocks to Mount Auburn Cemetery. Emma's grave had become a weekly destination, but no longer as a shrine to unbearable loss. Instead, Sarah visited to share stories of the healing work that had grown from the lessons Emma had tried to teach years ago. "Lucia saw her brother today," Sarah said, kneeling to place fresh flowers beside the headstone. "Just like you tried to show me that presence continues beyond physical boundaries. I finally understand what you were teaching me, baby. That healing happens through connection. That medicine without love is just sophisticated mechanics." Snow had begun falling again, the same soft flakes that had marked her first return to this grave 6 months ago. But now Sarah felt warmth spreading through her chest, the certainty that love expressed as radical accompaniment could transform any space into sacred ground. Tomorrow she would return to the center where children taught each other that nobody had to face darkness alone. Tonight, she would carry Emma's presence forward into a world desperate for the medicine of connection her daughter had understood instinctively. The real work was no longer just beginning, it was flourishing, one relationship at a time, exactly as it should be.